In this video I'm going to show how the assert macro in C++ interacts with different CMake build types. So for the purposes of this demo I'm going to use this public repository on GitHub. If you'd like to walk through this demo on your own, you can also clone this repository. It's accessible by the general public. And the particular code I want to look at is in this particular subdirectory, so I'm going to change to this directory. If I look at the files that are here, there's a single C++ source code file and a CMake List file. If I look at these files in more detail, the CMake List file doesn't have anything too particularly special, except I'm just printing out the values of some CMake variables, in particular the CMake build type variable. I'm going to print out its value, and I'm also going to print out the value of various different compiler flag related variables. So this variable here, CMake CXX flags, this is just extra compiler flags that are always used for all of your compiles. The CMake CXX flags debug, these are special options that are used when you're doing a debug type build in CMake. These flags are used, CMake CXX flags release are used when you're doing a release build, and then there's some other types of builds, release with debug info and minimum size release, and there's some compiler flags for them as well. But I'm not going to focus too much on these other build types. Then if we look at the C++ source code file, it's a very simple program. It just prints out a message saying it's about to execute a line of code which has an assert false. So this should always terminate the program if the assertion is actually executed, because this condition is always false, so the assertion always fails. So it should never reach this line and print out assertions are disabled. Well, unless assertions are disabled. So this is a very simple program, and it's intended just to illustrate the use of different build types in CMake. Some build types will disable assertions, some of them won't, and we can see this more easily with this particular example program. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a debug build type. So I'm specifying, I'm going to use CMake to do a configuration of the build, and I'm going to set the CMake build type variable to debug. So this is setting the build type to a debug build. When I do this, you'll notice that the particular values that are printed, these are basically being printed by the extra lines that I had in my CMake List file. So not surprisingly, it's saying the build type is debug, which it should be, because up here we set the build type to debug. On this particular configuration of CMake, you'll notice that when we're doing a debug build, it always adds the -G option, which basically enables debug information in the compiler. So this is highly desirable when you're doing debugging. If we're doing a release build, it enables it defines the macro ndebug, and what this macro does when it's defined is it disables the assert macro. Effectively, it makes the assert macro into a no-op, so everywhere where you have asserts in your code, they're effectively commented out and replaced by no code at all. So if you want to rely on assertions, you definitely do not want this symbol to be defined, because it's going to turn off all the assertions in your code. And this is an important thing to be aware of, because if you're using assertions to help debug your code, you want to make sure that they're not being disabled. Otherwise, it's pointless to put assertions in your code, because they'll never fail, because they're never actually generating any code in your program. Anyway, so in this case we're doing a debug type build, so what this means is that these flags here will apply. So the ndebug symbol is not going to be defined, so we would expect that when we build our code and run it, that the assertion actually will be present in our code, and the code will actually fail. So I'll build the code now, and we can confirm that it actually is using the -G option when it's compiling. You can see it's appearing here. If we now run the program, again, we would expect it to fail, so it says it's about to execute assert false, and then when the assert false is hit, it actually terminates the program as we'd expect. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to switch to using a release type build. So I'm going to run the configuration stage of CMake again, but this time I'm going to specify a build type of release. And again, I'm printing out the values of these variables each time just so that we can kind of refresh our memory as to what they're set to. In this case, we're doing a release build, so the compiler should always add these options, or sorry, CMake should always add these options to the compiler for each compile. So importantly, the ndebug symbol is being defined, so what we would expect is all of our assertions are going to be disabled. So if I build the program now, and then actually run it, what we would expect in this case is the assertion is not going to fail because the assertion effectively is removed from our code because the ndebug symbol has been defined. And this is exactly what happens. It says about to execute assert, false, but obviously it's not executing this assertion because this should cause the program to terminate, but instead it continues on and it prints out the message assertions are disabled, which came after the assert false in the original source code. If we then just do a CMake without specifying any build type at all, what this does is it just doesn't change the build type from whatever it was before. It's effectively cached. A lot CMake variables are cached. So if we do this, you'll notice that the release type is still, or the build type is still release, what it was previously. It's just using the cached value. So if we actually want to force it to not use any build type at all, we have to explicitly undefine the CMake build type variable. And you can undefine CMake variables with the -U option to CMake. This just set the variable, well, basically unset the variable so it's not set at all. If we do this, now you'll notice that the build type is not set at all. And if in this case we try to build things, you might wonder, well, what's going to happen? Because we haven't set any build type, so like, what's going to happen in terms of these extra flag options that are specified here? What will happen is none of these are used. So it's not that if we don't specify it, it defaults to a debug type build or a release type build. It's not any of these things. So if you actually build this, you'll notice that when we're compiling, for example, the -G option is not used. This is not being considered a debug build. The compiler flags for a release build are not being used. None of these flags are being used. It's not any of these types of builds. It's just a kind of generic unnamed type of build. So for this reason, probably it's a good idea to specify explicitly the build type because it gives you more control over what particular options are being provided. And if you're doing any kind of debugging, probably you want the -G option to be provided to the compiler, so you probably want to do a debug build. So this basically is an important thing to keep in mind if you're using assertions to help debug your code. And of course, assertions are a very good practice to use. Just make sure that you're not accidentally disabling them by using, for example, a release build or something that defines the ndebug macro.